Joining us now, our good friend Lucien Smith. He's an attorney. He's the former chairman of the Mississippi GOP. Lucien, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, great to be with you, Gerard.
Great facilities here, aren't they?
Oh, they're amazing. It's world class, and it's something we can be proud of in Mississippi. I mean, this is like being in a Smithsonian, and we don't have a lot of stuff like this. It's something we ought to be proud of.
It truly is awesome, and the meeting facilities here are really cool, too.
Yeah, and I think it's been great to watch different organizations. Like I think about the event Empower had back in the spring here. I mean, it's great that people are taking advantage of it and bringing more people in part because I don't know that many people realize what a great facility this is and what a great museum we've got. And, you know, you bring somebody in for an event and they go, gosh, I kind of want to go check that out. So it really is great.
Yeah, it's awesome. They do a great job. It's so well curated, and the exhibits are just fantastic. Like you said, world class. But we are happy to be here, and as you know, we are doing so in advance of the Veterans Day program next week. Veterans Day next Thursday, November the 11th. The program right here at the two museums. Wednesday, November the 10th, and what a great event that's going to be, but something we need to do for
Absolutely.
sure.
Yeah,
and had the Adjutant General on earlier, Colonel McDaniel on the Mississippi Veterans Affairs Board. And like I say, the words just don't seem to be adequate to thank those.
I think that's right.
We get busy in our lives and forget so much about those that sacrifice on our behalf. But anyhow, we're proud to be part of this deal. So we wanted to get you on. You and I have been chatting a little bit offline about these vaccine mandates. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, the Biden administration finally released the rules after the executive order. So to back up, he issues an executive order. Let me make sure I got this straight. Back in September.
That's right.
Instructing the Department of Labor, right, through OSHA, I think, ultimately, which is part of the Department of Labor, to act on that order and produce these rules. And the first thing that hit me, Lucien, when I saw them is that they're like 3 inches high.
Oh, yeah.
That's just typical government bureaucracy. Here's 3 inches of rules that essentially detail these vaccine mandates. And it was thought that maybe those would be in effect in December the 8th, I think. Now it looks like it's January the 4th. January the 4th. So I think it's accurate to say that you're going to see some lawsuits challenging these things.
You've seen some already filed. Ben Shapiro with the Daily Wire, they filed one yesterday. My understanding, I think the governor of Mississippi and the Attorney General are filing a suit here. There's going to be a ton of litigation about it, and I don't think it's ever going to go into effect because I just think on so many levels, it's got so many problems with it.
Okay.
The biggest, the easiest problem that it's got is it's being done under this emergency process. Generally, when you adopt new regulations at the federal level or at the state level, you go through a notice and comment period that takes a very long time that allows people to look at the rule. They respond. The agency has to consider the different comments that come in. But they've done this under an emergency process, and the law that allows them to do that requires that there be a grave danger that allows them to skip all these normal processes. Well, if it's a grave danger, then the rule should have been put into place back in September when the president said it was necessary, or it should be put into place today. But by them saying, well, it's a grave danger and people are going to die, but we're going to give you 60 days or 90 days to finally get around to it, is a pretty good sign there's not a grave danger.
Yeah.
And I think when you get into the analysis here, I don't want to minimize COVID. COVID is a serious thing.
Sure.
Hundreds of thousands of people have died from it. It is not the common cold. I'm vaccinated. My wife's vaccinated. I think for most people, getting vaccinated is the right decision. But we know from the data we see, if you're vaccinated, your chances of developing serious COVID are dramatically down. Your chances of being hospitalized are dramatically down.
Yep.
So if you're in one of these facilities that's subject to OSHA regulation and you want to be protected from COVID, you don't need a federal mandate making your coworkers get vaccinated. You just need to go get vaccinated.
Yeah.
And we're at a point in the country, and you know this, where essentially everyone in this country who wants to be vaccinated and doesn't have a medical something medical prohibiting them from doing it has gotten vaccinated.
Yeah.
So I just think it's going to be very difficult for them to demonstrate that they satisfy this grave danger requirement of an emergency rule.
All right, so grave danger, I mean, is that the terminology?
That's the terminology in the statute.
Okay.
And you can imagine a scenario, if we had something like Ebola, if all of a sudden Ebola was tearing through the country and we had a vaccine that could stop it right then, it would make a lot of sense for OSHA to say, we have a grave danger. We're going to mandate if you open your business up for people to come in, you're going to have a vaccine. But they would do it immediately. They'd say it's required. Maybe you give 10 days so you can do the logistics of getting people vaccinated. But you wouldn't say it's such a grave danger, so many people are going to die that sometime after Christmas
I got you.
We're going to impose this rule. And that's just one of the problems with it.
This is another situation to me, just offering a personal opinion here. This is another situation where you can have kind of a coexistence of positions. And what I mean by that is you can support vaccines but be opposed to vaccine mandates.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly where I am. I mean, I think we've got the data that shows this vaccine is highly effective at keeping you from getting sick.
Yep.
I think you ought to get it. The data, to me, I'm not a scientist. There may be scientists who disagree with it, but the reporting I have read suggests that the reduction in transmission because you're vaccinated is not as strong as the reduction in hospitalization. So if you want to be protected from this virus, you should get vaccinated. But I am not offended at the idea, based on the risk levels that we're seeing from this disease, that if someone doesn't want to get vaccinated from it, whether it's because of obviously if there's a health reason or a religious reason, or if they've just got skepticism because this process has felt so forced on them, I think that's their right. Now, I think constitutionally states probably do have the right to mandate it. The federal government doesn't. But I'm just opposed to this vaccine mandate. I don't think it's a good decision.
And you and I have discussed this before, so let's take that a step further. Take the government out of it. A private business, I believe, should have the right or reserves the right to implement a mandate as a condition of employment.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think it's a private employer. I mean, again, going back to the federal mandate, I don't think the federal government should have that mandate.
Agreed.
But I think if you, as a private employer, want to say, if you want to work for me, I'm going to require you to do certain things, which they already do in so many other contexts.
Sure.
I mean, you've got to wear whatever the dress code is. You've got to show up at the hours. You've got to complete the tasks. It is not unreasonable to say, I want you to be vaccinated against COVID. Now, I think legally you've got to make accommodations for health problems. If somebody's got an allergy, my understanding is people with egg allergies in particular can't take at least the Pfizer vaccine. You've got to make health exceptions, and you have to provide reasonable accommodation for deeply held religious beliefs by people.
Yeah.
But, yes, as a general rule, if you're a private employer, I think it is your right to be able to decide who does and doesn't work for you. And if one of those conditions is that you get a vaccine, I think that's your right. And I know we've talked about this before, but to me it's the perfect example. You go back to Masterpiece Cake Shop, which was the baker in Colorado who did not want to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding because he believed that marriage was between one man and one woman. He declined to do it, and Colorado tried to levy these incredible fines under an anti-discrimination law they have. And at the time, all of us said, that's tyranny. A private business should be able to make these decisions. And the same thing's here. If Masterpiece Cake Shop wants to say, if you're going to bake a cake here, you have to be vaccinated.
Totally
or
agree.
if you're going to buy a cake here, you got to wear a mask. That's their right. But in a free society, we've got the right to say, well, I'm not going to shop there. I'm going to walk across the street and go to the baker who doesn't require his employees to be vaccinated or doesn't require masks.
Well, as a business person and one who was responsible to a board and for promulgating business policy, my take is I don't want the government in my boardroom. I don't want the government in my handbook. I understand there's regulations and rules and stuff we have to abide by, but the less I have government involved in my boardroom, in my handbook, I believe the more prosperous and the better working environment I can create.
That's right, because business owners know better than government 100 times out of 100 what is going to grow their business, what's going to bring in more customers, what's the best way to run it. The government doesn't. I mean, that is not what government does.
This is gross overreach. We're going to talk about it some more when we come back. We've got Lucien Smith. He's an attorney, and we're talking about vaccine mandates and the legality, even the constitutionality of those. We'll discuss that some more when we come back. Midday, we're talking to Lucien Smith. He's an attorney, former chairman of the Mississippi Republican Party. We're talking about vaccine mandates. Okay, so Richard in Jackson says telling employees that they must be vaccinated is like saying you have to have red hair to work here. At what level will it stop?
I mean, I think the difference is your hair color or your skin color is an immutable characteristic, which means you can't change it. I guess hair color you could dye, but I mean But vaccines, you either get it or you don't get it. And you've got the right, if you don't want to work for your employer who requires it, you can go find another employer. Now, I think at the same time, it is a business's right to impose those regulations, to impose that requirement. They've got to think about, and you know this as somebody who's run a business, you got to think about your labor needs.
Sure.
And you are going to have, and we're seeing this right now, people voting with their feet who say, I'm not willing to comply with that mandate. Yeah. And so I think anybody who's running a business right now is thinking about the risk of not having folks vaccinated versus the risk of having a bunch of employees say, well, I'm gone. I'm going to go find another job. And right now it's really a seller's market for labor. I mean, people are having trouble finding workers. So if you are at a job and your employer says you have to have a vaccine, you got to show me proof of vaccination to work here, in a lot of cases, people have got the ability to say, well, that's fine, I'm going to go somewhere else, and people will take advantage of it.
Well, how is that different than requiring a background check? And if you have a company policy that says we don't hire folks with a felony background,
right? Similar
deal, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why people who are hesitant about the vaccine get offended at some of these comparisons. I think legally they are the same because it's a business saying, these are our minimum requirements for you to work here, and one of them happens to be being current on the recommended vaccinations. And you and I have talked about this before also. I think the biggest problem we've got with the way vaccines have been treated in this country since the beginning of COVID is this top-down absolutism for people who are pro-vaccine.
Right.
I mean, I think people should get vaccinated.
Yeah.
I also understand why, we've watched the media over the course of the last 4 years just gaslight us over and over and over again, try to convince us of what they believe. Why now, when people are being told, go get a vaccine that's relatively recently developed, that's only been out for less than 12 months, why people are hesitant. And I think if we had more compassion from the people at the very top in terms of how they dealt with people, rather than saying, by God, you're going to get a vaccine or you're evil, we'd have much higher rates of vaccination.
Totally agree.
Because people are skeptical.
I've said it so many times, if they just shut up, we'd have had a lot better, more cooperation. It's become a cult. It seems like.
It has.
It's become a cult. My body, my choice is from Carl on the C Spire text line. An employer shouldn't have the right to determine my health choices. I'm vaccinated. It was my choice. I hear you, Carl, but I'll go back to what Lucien said, and I'll put it maybe in another set of language, Lucien, is that the market is the purest form of discernment.
That's right.
If you as an employer say we don't hire redheaded people, you probably ain't going to make it. That's just a fact. If you and as you were suggesting, we're already starting to see the ramifications and the backlash of people walking and leaving employers and saying, I'm not going to do it. Employers are going to be faced with a very difficult choice. You can either stay the course and maintain that as a policy and possibly suffer the economic consequences, or you can make some adjustments because the market has spoken. The market, not government. That's the difference.
And you saw that. The great example of that to me is the mask mandates. Once we got rid of a state mask mandate, you saw some stores, for various reasons, all their choice, that continued to mandate masks to enter their stores. And I think that's their right to say, you got to have a mask if you want to shop in my store. I found that I generally chose to shop in the ones that didn't continue to require masks because I thought it was silly post-COVID. Post-vaccine for COVID. I tended to think it was value signaling from the corporations. And so the best example, I've got near my house 2 gas stations. One had a mask mandate, one didn't, and I made a point of always going to the one that didn't have a mask mandate because I preferred the choice they were making. But to your point, that's how the market works. And in most places in the country, you're going to have those options, and I think the market sorts it out pretty well.
Yeah, and that's the thing is let the market do its job, let it work. So President Biden said if you take the vaccine, this on the C-Spire text line, you can't catch COVID. I heard the audio of him saying exactly that. I do think that early on that was the assumption, or that certainly was the conclusion, and from the guidance. But it's since been determined that wasn't the case. As more people have gotten vaccinated, but still, though, the data's pretty clear. You're at much less risk if you're vaccinated. And then now entering the picture, you may have seen are 2 therapies, one from Merck, one from Pfizer, pills, and that have found to be extremely effective. It remains to be seen whether or not the market will and consumers, I guess, will be on board with that. UK is already, I think, approved the Merck pill, if I'm not mistaken. I noticed that I may have it backwards, but in Pfizer, the other one, their study says it's 89% effective. I know that one is more effective than the other. They're both pill form, and when this announcement came out, the stock of the one that's less effective, it went down, and the one that's more effective went up. And it's thought to be from the investment community based on this news. Well, people are going to take the one, if they're going to take a pill, they're going to take the one that's more effective. They're probably little or no difference in cost.
But that text it is a perfect illustration of what you and I have talked about multiple times. We need more humility from the people in leadership about COVID. And I do think that's one of the ways that President Biden has really failed in this challenge is stuff like that. I mean, I remember back in the spring where they said, get vaccinated so you can take your mask off. Get vaccinated so you can go back to family barbecues. Well, then a month later they said, well, but you should really keep wearing your mask. Now we've got this get vaccinated and you won't get COVID. Well, then there are these breakthrough cases, and it increases the skepticism. And I think if we had people in leadership who had said, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of the vaccine, the beginning of the virus back in early 2020, I think if we'd had leaders who said, look, this is a new variant of a coronavirus, we're going to keep making changes, we're going to keep learning as this thing comes on. And I think if they were saying now, you should get a vaccine because all the data shows us that you're much less likely to get hospitalized, rather than saying, go get it and you'll never get COVID. Yeah. And then 2 or 3 breakthrough infections happen and people go, well, obviously they're lying to us, rather than just speaking with a little bit of humility as they're leading. The guidance, the messaging has changed. You could accept that, given that as time progresses, we learn more. We acquire more knowledge. I get that. The thing that's always bothered me, Lucien, is they've never said, but we may learn some stuff down the road, and we may adjust this. It's dope. This is it. This is the way it is. And then they come back a few weeks, months later, whatever, and say, we're changing all that. They don't even say that. They just say, here's something new, without really acknowledging, well, we got that wrong. And just being honest about it. There's a private organization in town where we spent a bunch of time that sent out a message about their masking requirements. Yeah. And I disagreed with the masking requirements. Okay. But they were very clear when they sent it out that we are doing our best. This is based on the guidance we've got. We're going to keep shifting over the course of the year as new information comes in. And I reached out to him and said, thank you for at least acknowledging you don't know everything and you're doing your best. And I think if people communicated that way and had for the last 18 months, I think we'd be in a much better position with this whole thing. What about employer liability if an employer imposes a vaccine mandate? And then let's say later on an employee experiences some sort of adverse reaction to it. What kind of liability do they have? I have not researched that thoroughly, but my instinct is there is some potential liability if that was a condition of employment. Certainly for current employees, if it's a new requirement, then I think there's certainly the potential of liability there. Now, you've seen some of these COVID-specific liability statutes get passed that remove some COVID-related liability, so it's possible you could see that in the vaccine context, or it's possible, frankly, that it exists already in the vaccine context and I don't realize it. But my instinct is that employers do have at least potential liability for something I think it was more applicable to the makers of the vaccine, right, with respect to liability. And I think that was just all part of the EUA provisions and just the effort to try to get something out.
my guess is if it went to court and an employer mandated somebody put something in their body and they had some sort of negative reaction, I suspect that they'd have to pay. That's just my gut feel.
That's my instinct also.
Yeah.
That's my instinct also.
So an employer has just got to make a decision if they're willing to take that risk or not.
Like so many other business decisions that people running a business make every day.
You want to hang around?
Sure.
Yeah, we got Lucien Smith. We're talking about vaccine mandates. I want to talk about this Pennsylvania case that I sent to you when we come back. And then what we might see here in the state of Mississippi. We've seen some rumblings from members of our legislature on this whole matter. So appreciate you being in today out here at 2 Mississippi Museums. Middays. We'll be right back. Coming in today as well. But we're talking to Lucien Smith. We are discussing vaccine mandates. And so Chris from Meridian on the C Spire text line just calls attention again to President Biden, who said, this is back in July. I do think this is true. We called it out. I think we played it on the air that he said, yeah, you can't spread the virus if you've been vaccinated. I think that's what the scientific community thought to be the case at the time.
Right.
It appears mostly that the Delta variant really changed that. But I don't know that that's relevant to this at this point. I appreciate that, Chris. And again, I think the responsible thing maybe to kind of frame that information, Lucien, would have been, and you just don't see this out of politicians, this is the best information we have today.
Right.
This is subject to change. You just don't see that coming out.
You don't see it from politicians generally, but Joe Biden is just such a blowhard that I just don't think he can control himself from speaking in these simplistic absolutes.
I agree.
That I think a more thoughtful leader would have said, we think this is going to dramatically reduce transmission, rather than saying, well, by golly, if you take it, you can't get anybody sick, and anybody who disagrees with you is just telling you malarkey. I mean, Biden just doesn't have the self-control to speak and think in a nuanced way.
But they never come back and say, sorry, Uncle, we got that wrong. Right? Mea culpa. I mean, we just don't ever get that.
But it leads to vaccine hesitancy. I mean, it leads to people who go, well, they keep lying to me, so how can I trust that them telling me that it's safe is not another one of their lies? And I'll say, I've gotten vaccinated. My wife is vaccinated. We are just fine. I think it's the right decision. But I think it's people's right to make that decision, whether they want to do it or not do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would also feel like we're talking about the lawsuits that are starting to pop up. 24 states, I think, is the latest data I saw. You mentioned that Governor Reeves has essentially asked the Attorney General, Lynn Fitch, to join in those lawsuits as well. I can't remember the first state that filed it. But to some extent, don't you feel like from a legal perspective, until the rules are promulgated, you're not just going to see a lot of activity there? But now that they are, and we just talked about it, it's like 3-inch thick rules from OSHA.
That's right.
Likely to see lawsuits.
It's very difficult to file a lawsuit because, and people on the text line, I remember pointing this out the last time we talked about it. I mean, initially it was essentially a press release.
Yeah.
It was the president saying, we're going to have this rule. Well, until you see it, it's tough to file a lawsuit. We now see the rule. We know how it would operate. And so I think you're just going to keep seeing lawsuits. And I do think ultimately it's going to be struck down. Yeah.
I tend to think that as well, and honestly, I hope so, because I think it's government overreach. Now, with respect to the requirement, certainly the requirement that a private sector organization with more than 100 employees, that to me is just black and white, clear government overreach. Now they're talking about possibly extending that to below 100 employees.
They're trying. The federal government, and it's just unambiguous, the federal government cannot impose a vaccine mandate directly. So the president could not issue an order. Congress couldn't pass a law that said every American has to get a COVID vaccine. Yeah. So they're looking for ways like this, using OSHA, using federal contractors and requiring it that way to try to get to as many people as possible. And I think it's counterproductive. I think it's unconstitutional. I think it's a bad use of federal power. Yeah. So Richard in Jackson says, I just asked him, so this is unfortunately, I think, the dilemma. If you don't like the idea that a private company is requiring a vaccine, even on their own accord, not because of any government mandate, and you and I think are in agreement that we support the right of a company to do so,
I'm not saying that the company should be free and veiled from any liability that might occur for anything that they impose in the workplace to an employee. It doesn't matter if it's vaccines or I don't know, anything else that might cause a problem. But nonetheless, what Richard says is, I've taken the flu shot 3 times, I've been sick, and I need to be compensated for that. Well, the remedy for that is to go to court, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have a very hard time winning if you've gone and gotten – now, I'm assuming by getting sick he means he got the flu, he was out of work for a day. Now, if he suffered some grievous harm, there is a trust fund that, as I understand it, provides compensation for vaccine-related injuries. There may be a legal theory to go against the manufacturer, but it really depends on the context.
Yeah. And so, again, it's a situation where you can support the science of vaccines but be opposed to government-imposed mandates. That's kind of where I am and you are.
You and I are on the exact same page there. I'm pro-vaccine, anti-mandate.
All right. So what about this some information that I dug into that says that the mandate may perhaps be unlawful because it's being issued by the wrong agency, by OSHA, as opposed to DHS.
No, that's a very valid point. I mean, anytime you're doing constitutional analysis on some sort of federal statute, there are really 2 steps. The first question is this authorized by the Constitution? The second is there some prohibition on it? And I think you got several ways this probably fails the first test. One of them is just that. I mean, the Congress has given delegated authority to the Department of Health and Human Services and some of its sub-agencies to regulate vaccines.
Yep.
It's given OSHA in the Department of Labor certain statutory authority to go out and regulate the workplace. But you really don't see many regulations like this coming out of OSHA.
Yeah.
It's more how do you secure your chemicals? Where do you have to wear a hat?
Yeah.
And so, the way Justice Scalia used to say it is that the Congress does not hide elephants in mouse holes. And so if Congress had intended to give OSHA this broad authority on vaccines, they wouldn't have hidden it in some tiny little provision. They would have said, and OSHA gets to determine what the vaccines you need to go to work for.
Yeah.
Since they've clearly given DHS authority over vaccines more broadly.
All right, final point with the time we got remaining, Lucien, is there are a lot of people that are calling for our state government to step in and pass a state law that would prohibit an employer from implementing the Biden-ordered mandates or just an employer from imposing a mandate. How does that work if you have a federal law as well, or would that pass legal muster?
So if the state the federal Constitution has a provision called the Supremacy Clause that says, essentially, if there's a conflict between a valid federal law and a valid state law, the federal law trumps. So if this mandate is constitutional, then I don't think the state can pass any law that prohibits it from going into effect. I'm great with them trying. I appreciate people doing everything they can to try to prevent it from going into effect. But if it's a constitutionally issued order or issued rule by OSHA, then there's very little the state can do, but except file a lawsuit like Governor Reeves did to try to strike it down, because I think that's ultimately what the courts are going to do. But there's not a lot that can be done that I'm aware of legislatively to fix it.
Yeah, so another point is that in the guidance, in the rules, a private employer, those over 100 that are required to vaccinate their employees, in lieu of that, the employees can test. But the employers, according to the rules as promulgated yesterday, are not required to bear the cost of that test. They can actually require the employee to bear that cost.
Well, and I think it's been deliberately drafted to be punitive to the people who don't get a vaccine.
I agree.
They basically are saying you got to run, you got to jump up and down on one foot all day while, chewing gum and trying to do backflips in the hopes that people are going to go, well, this is such a pain, I'm just going to go get the dead gum vaccine.
Yeah.
So I think courts will see straight through that.
Yeah, as an employer, this is on the C-Spire text line, I will not mandate health choices. What's next? Your employer telling you what brand of insulin or high blood pressure meds to use. I agree with you, and I think this all goes back, does it not, to just common sense reasonableness test in terms
Absolutely.
of an employer having conditions of employment. I mean, your work hours, your dress, I don't know, turning in your timesheets on time. We could go through a litany of sort of employer conditions.
Well, and we talk about this all the time. Just because somebody can do something,
yes,
doesn't mean that they should.
Totally
so I think
agree.
an employer can say you have to be vaccinated, but that's not going to be the right decision for every employer. It may not be the right decision for any employer, but I think they still have the right to do it, whether they choose to do it or not.
And I should get your take on this. I believe the employer has that right. As an employer, I wouldn't do it, though. I disagree with that from a business perspective.
I think it's going to be a problem for a lot of employers because you're going to end up with labor issues. But I think you got to think about, how many people are going to be out if you don't do it. How do you comply? And it's a business decision.
Totally agree.
People have to make.
I totally agree. Appreciate you joining us, Lucien. That was a great discussion.
Gerard.
Thanks
Great
a lot.
To see you.
Yeah, man. Rachel Myers, Deputy Director of 2 Mississippi Museums, will join us next here on Middays with Gerard. We're down at 2 Mississippi Museums.